My name is Jason Brent. I'm a PhD candidate in economics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of both the North Carolina Justice Center, who's one of the sponsors of this event, and Scholars for North Carolina's Future, which is the other sponsor. At the end of the event, we're going to have some more remarks about the SNCF. But we just wanted to give you a little bit of a description. They're a group of scholars from across the state and across disciplines who share a common concern about some of the current policy directions in the state of North Carolina. And as scholars feel both a moral and professional responsibility to use both their own research and their knowledge of current research or thinking in their fields to raise questions and suggest alternatives to those policies. So why are we here today? You'll hear from the panelists today that we have in the state of North Carolina, for the last little while, we've had a broad swath of policies, from reductions in unemployment insurance to the shifting the tax burden away from high earners towards a consumption tax, which has been proposed, to proposals to limit regulation and oversight of businesses. And these are generally described both by their supporters and by the media, perhaps unfortunately, as pro-growth, pro-business agenda. And what we brought together today are a group of economists and people with economic understanding to suggest that neither today or in the future is there significant evidence that these are the most effective set of policies for the future of North Carolina. And they're going to talk about economic research and economic thinking that really brings into focus the trade-offs that these policies and other alternatives create. So I would like to introduce our speakers one at a time and then call them to speak. They're each going to give a presentation, then we're going to have a 30-minute conversation, and then following that, there'll be opportunity for the audience to ask some questions. So our first speaker is Dean Baker, who's the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Followed by Donald Frey, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Wake Forest. Then Maryann Feldman, Heninger Distinguished Professor of the Department of Public Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. And then Patrick Conway, the Professor and Chair of the Department of Economics at UNC Chapel Hill. And finally Chatterjee, who previously worked in the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House and is currently an associate professor at the Fuqua School here at Duke. So we'll begin with Dean Baker.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate the chance to come out here. It gives me a great chance to get away from Washington, which is actually cold and snowing, so which is unusual for Washington time of year. I mean, it is more south than north. I always think from Chicago. But, anyhow, so it's very nice to be down here. So and good audience. So what I want to talk about was very quickly 4 different topics. I'm saying quickly because you realize they're big topics. And just sort of outline where I think, my view on the take of economic research and how it's often certainly different, I think, from what the perspective of your legislature governor is giving. The topic's minimum wage. I want to talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act. Then unemployment insurance benefits, where your state really has been a leader of sorts. And stimulus. And again, don't worry, I'm not going to go on for hours. I just want to sort of outline issues here. Story of the minimum wage. This is, to my view, it's kind of fascinating because you're hearing a public debate that I think is way at odds with the policy, the economic debate in academia. In public policy circles, political circles, we're hearing job killer, going to see massive loss of jobs. Some of you may have heard about the report from the Congressional Budget Office saying that President Obama's proposal will cost 500,000 jobs. That's touted a really big thing, really big job loss. The academic literature, and at this point it's a very, very deep literature. I'm not an expert on this, but my friends are, and I've certainly reviewed much of it. I think most of the literature finds no job loss, but the point is the people who do find job loss find relatively little job loss. So you do have some economists, David Newmark probably being the most prominent, some of you may have heard of him, who've done a lot of work showing yes, there is job loss. Well, the point is that the job loss, or I would say that even those people find, is relatively modest. So the question you're asking about is if you have a high increase in the minimum wage, how many people lose their jobs? If you take the negative views on this, you're looking at, say, an increase in the minimum wage of 30% or so would reduce employment among teens, among the affected population, perhaps on the order of 3%. Now you go, okay, 3% people losing jobs. Important thing to understand, these are relatively short-term jobs for the most part, high turnover in other words. So we're not talking literally about sending 3% of these workers packing. What we're really talking about in the vast majority of cases is that when people start to look for a job, they quit one job, look for another job, they just enter the labor force, probably they'll spend more time looking. And the trade-offs there, in effect, amount to a situation where you're saying that low-wage workers, teenage workers will on average work 3% less. When they do work, they'll have 30% more pay. And I think, again, if I had David Newmark here, maybe be jumping up and down, yelling I'm misrepresenting this research, but I think that's basically the story you're looking at. The range of research in academia is very, very different from the story you get in political debates. You don't have a support massive job loss. Okay, so I'll just stop with that and just give you that as one example where I think the research is very different and could lend a lot to the public debate if it were more visible. The Affordable Care Act, again, this has been presented, another job killer, another Congressional Budget Office report showing the study that was released showed, it was interpreted as showing a loss of 2 million jobs. What the report actually said was they expected a reduction in work on the order of 2 million to 2% of the work, up to 2% of the workforce, work hours. And what they were literally saying, and they were very clear on this if anyone reads through the report, people will opt not to work. And basic story here is you have a lot of people that work now because that's their only way they can get health insurance. They can get through their employer, they can't get it through the individual market. So if we suddenly say, okay, you can get insurance through the exchanges, you have a lot of parents, young kids, they might say, okay, I'd rather work a part-time job. I don't have to work full-time. Okay, or they might drop out of the labor force for a period of time. It might take 6 months, a year, be home with their kids. That's what it's talking about. It's talking about a lot of people, older people, say in their late 50s, early 60s, they don't qualify for Medicare, they have health conditions. Getting insurance in the individual market would be incredibly expensive. Now they can do it through the exchanges. A lot of those people will retire early, or they'll choose to work part-time. They'll work at a job that is easier for them to work at, particularly since they might have physical issues that make it difficult for them to work a long time. Again, this is in the report, but this has been widely misrepresented. To my view, this is like 100% positive. The opponents of the Affordable Care Act have been very effective in presenting this as a very negative feature, well, fewer people working. I think it's bad if people don't work because they don't have the option. I think it's great if people have the option not to work because they can get health insurance through non-work related actions. They can get through the exchanges. That's all positive. Similar story, unemployment insurance benefits. So your governor wants to give people the kick. The idea is, we have these freeloaders out there. They're being lazy, and they're living off the rest of us. So we got to give them a little kick and go, okay, you got to get in the workforce and go out and work. There's been a lot of research on this, and pretty much across the political spectrum, there might be someone who's gotten something different, but people look at what happens to workers when their unemployment insurance benefits end, and because that happens. And the overwhelming finding is that they end up dropping out of the labor force because to get unemployment insurance benefits, you have to go through the motion of looking for a job. Now, I understand some people might not be that serious, which would be understandable. If you've been looking for a job for 60 weeks, 70 weeks, and you don't find anything, I can believe, the 71st week, 75th week, you're probably not looking all that hard. But nonetheless, to get benefits, you have to go through the motion. So when someone from the Census Bureau knocks on your door and says, were you looking for work last month? Well, answer, yes, you were. Okay, your benefits expire. Well, overwhelmingly what happens is people stop looking for work because they see there's nothing out there and they don't have to do it to get benefits because they're not getting benefits. Very few of them get jobs. Okay, study after study have done that. I don't know the politics of everyone who's done that, but I don't know of any study that shows that in any high percentage people will suddenly go out and get jobs. And the experience you've had here, your unemployment rate fell. People stop looking for work. There's no uptick in employment. There's no survey, no data showing that South Carolina had some big surge in jobs. You didn't. You had people that had been looking for work. Now they don't have a reason to look for work. They don't think there's any jobs out there. You stop looking for work, so you lower your unemployment rate. So again, that's something I think, I don't think there's much ambiguity in the academic research. Obviously there is very big ambiguity, very big confusion, I guess I should say, in the public debate. Stimulus, huge topic. I'll just make a couple points on this. The basic story, which, I'm going to blame President Obama here for not getting this across very well. I mean, basic story of stimulus, this is, Washington, this is framed, I'm sure you get the same here. Do you like the public sector, do you like the private sector? And I think that's just silliness. The whole point here is we got a very big downturn in the economy because the private sector collapsed. We had a housing bubble that was driving demand in the private sector. Housing bubble burst. The residential construction that it was driving, that just collapsed. We lost on the order of $600 billion a year in annual construction. The consumption that was being driven by all this housing equity, bubble-generated equity, that disappeared. That consumption disappeared as well. So what you're talking about with the stimulus, it wasn't a question whether you liked the private sector or liked the government. The point was that the private sector wasn't creating enough demand to create full employment. That was the issue with the stimulus. Do you want to get back to full employment? The private sector will not do that. And that's, a point to my view, and this is intro econ, we were talking about this a moment ago. You can make it more sophisticated, make it more complicated, but the basic point is a very simple one. You need demand to maintain full employment. Private sector is not going to do that. And that's something I think, again, I blame President Obama as, kind of teacher in chief here, because this really did fall to him. He didn't do that. Here too, as I say, I think there's a very simple story where there will be arguments in academia, unfortunately, because there are macroeconomists who will come up with, I think, very complex and convoluted stories saying that that is not the reality. But there again, I think it's a case where, there is a very simple story from the academic literature that, I think is borne out overwhelming. I don't know if people read Paul Krugman, he's a friend and I'm a big fan of his work, and I think to a very large extent he's laid this out. It's basically a simple story. And that's something that I think the public has to know, and if they understood, they would think very differently about the issue. So long and short, not to bore you, not go on at endless length, I think there are a lot of areas, these being four very important ones, where there's sort of very clear findings we could take from academic work could have a very big impact on the public debate if they're more widely understood. So I'll stop with that.
Right. Thank you very much. And we'll continue the conversation with Donald Frey.
Much of my writing in the last number of years has been on economic morality, and I was asked to kind of frame the issue in terms of moral terms. I can't do that in 6 or 7 minutes, but I thought it would be very useful to see the role of the concept of scarcity as it has a moral impact and sets the stage for people's willingness to either be mean-spirited or more generous in their outlook as it affects public policy. We can look at the last several years as a story of scarcity, framing things in terms of scarcity and want, and therefore the appropriate decision being austerity in one form or another, generally on the backs of those least able to afford the austerity. But deficits are simply another way of talking about scarcity. It's simply putting it in accounting terms and saying, well, you're living with fake abundance because you're just borrowing against the future. And of course, talk about where will our grandchildren be? We're living off them, and so on, became quite common. So I would argue that the debate was framed very much by conservatives talking a kind of scarcity language. When scarcity dominates the narrative, politics and policies are passed in the name of austerity, which appears to be the logical and good way to approach things. This is exactly what Herbert Hoover did. You have to balance a budget and so on. And in convoluted ways, they could even say that's the only way to restore growth and so on. We know that didn't work with Herbert Hoover, but really nothing's ever learned. We're kind of back to the same point now. In terms of my thesis that prosperity and bad times do have an effect on sort of the policy outlook, I would point you to a book probably 5 years back by Benjamin Friedman, the Harvard professor, Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, or a title something like that, where maybe with the exception of the New Deal, he pretty much argues that nothing good ever came out of periods of hard times. We become negative, punitive, and so on. Another classic, of course, is John Kenneth Galbraith's Conventional Wisdom, which actually was a story of 19th century story of scarcity, dominating a whole way of thinking and actually dominating our decisions about what's good and what's not. And his story, of course, was that the scarcity story essentially said production's too little, going all the way back to Malthus, and consequently biasing the debate in terms of well, there's just not enough for a public sector. And of course, he could be very ironic and sarcastic about things and point out that, of course, there was plenty of production, and in fact, advertising was needed to convince, on the margin, people to consume some of the less worthwhile things that were being produced. I actually found some excellent quotes from a Brookings volume that came out about 20 years ago, right about after the savings and loan financial crash, and I'm convinced that we learned nothing at all from that in terms of what happened. That was just a preview for what happened in 2008. One of the chapters was contributed by Daniel Yankelevich, who had a polling company, a polling survey company, and I thought there were some excellent quotes. He was summarizing the period maybe from the 1960s up to the point where he was writing in the savings and loan crisis. He says, the typical American attitude in good times could be paraphrased, I'm doing okay, why shouldn't others have a break too? The war on poverty and entitlement programs for the needy enjoyed large-scale support. People were willing to help others to pay extra taxes. But the opposite effect was coming by the early 1990s. The attitude became, it's rough out there, we better look out for ourselves. Here's the kind of ethical tilt. The struggle for existence came to be perceived as a zero-sum game, negatively affecting people's willingness to devote resources to solve other people's problems. And then something that seems almost to have come back again 20 years later, he says, Americans were in a state of semi-shock and anxiety. People were persuaded that the country had lost its way. They grew fearful that the budget deficit was taking the nation's future hostage, that the next generation would not live as well as the past. We've heard this plenty of times in the last few years. Well, that's public attitudes in a loose sense. If you have a psychology of hard times and people are scared, they begin to worry about themselves, they close in and look out for themselves, and therefore feel certainly less commitment to doing things for others. I'd say that there's actually a good moral proposition here about scarcity, and that's the proposition is that no one morally is obligated to do what's impossible. So if your best knowledge tells you, well, go back to Malthus, that population will invariably, scientifically, outrun food, or you could generalize to resources. He was telling his generation and those that followed, poverty is inevitable, therefore you can be excused for not doing anything about it. You can't have a real obligation to do anything to change what's impossible to change. I mean, it's definitional, but the real work is in making a case that it's scientifically true, that that's the way it's going to be. And of course, he spoke at just about the worst time possible, although people didn't perceive it. The Industrial Revolution and a whole host of other revolutions after that made the idea of no productivity growth passé. So there is this connection. If I have a minute or two, that you can actually say, okay, in a mindset of scarcity, what are the kinds of ethical or moral values that become popular, which appeal to people when their mindset is in that way? Well, in a world of scarcity, competitive values appear to be realistic ones. Everyone's your potential competitor for the few jobs that are out there or for the food that's available. Utilitarian virtues are popular. Think of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard Almanac. You do you're honest and so on, because it will help you succeed to make a living, not for other reasons, like there's a moral imperative or something along those lines. Production is what matters. The work ethic becomes all important, and concerns about others should not be allowed to interfere. There tends to be this equation that Galbraith spoke about, government unproductive, private sector productive, so bias your perceptions in those directions. Sometimes there's a tendency to blame the weakest members of society. If they're poor, is it because they're not trying? Are they simply diverting resources? You see this in the more sophisticated ways, but with the kind of incentives mentality that's very popular in more conservative economics, that, well, unemployment comp is an incentive to shirk, essentially, is that kind of argument. If simple math would prove that things are not really so scarce, in other words, take the total GDP divided by the people, and there'd actually be enough for everybody, if there were equality, or even something approaching that, well, then we find that there's a professional group busy justifying inequality, why it must be that way. Perhaps that's enough said. I would say, and not even that facetiously, that you can see, this was all perceived in the 19th century. Dickens writing about Scrooge. The Scrooge values are essentially, what he saw coming out of that perception. Scared people, worried about want, never could have enough, becoming miserly, and so on. So all of this is true only if scarcity is inevitable, and people have an interest, some people have an interest in proving it inevitable, and this spins out in various ways, and it can be done in very sophisticated ways. So I would say, without going on and on, this certainly provides a framework for looking at the way people, having been scared, are willing to accept policies that cut back on unemployment compensation, cut back on educational budgets, cut back on higher education as well, where you literally have an unwillingness to take free Medicaid money from the federal government, and so on and so forth, and everybody knows that story. What's wrong with I'll end with what's wrong with the scarcity mentality. Of course, I mentioned that Dickens, I mentioned Dickens, but I mentioned that Malthus, was wrong almost about as soon as he wrote, with the various application of science and technology to production. And maybe I'll just end by saying, if you look back at the two different streams of ethical thought, in my own writing, I thought it useful to say, all right, there's two streams that have existed for a long time, and each one connects values to an underlying view of the world, often aided and abetted by, quote, science in one form or another. But if you look at the other stream that's more generous, if you will, instead of saying the world's problems are due to scarcity and there's nothing that can be done about them, they've typically pointed to injustice. Whether you're talking about William Penn or others, or the social gospel movement at the late 19th century, the alternative to the scarcity narrative has been that the real problem is caused by injustice. And indeed, if there is injustice, no matter how much growth objectively eliminated scarcity, we'd still never deal with the problems of the people who are suffering in society. So that sort of frames it.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to Maryann.
Okay, very good. And so please forgive me, I'm going to use slides. And I'm also going to try to talk while seated, which will be a challenge for me.
You can stand.
Stand. No, I've adjusted. I'm going to try this. And so really, I'm going to talk about economic development. And I have been here for, it'll be 6 years, and really researching the industrial genesis of the research triangle. trying to understand how the economic prosperity in this region was created over time. This is joint work with Nicola Lowe. And what's obvious about it is this is an industrial cluster that was consciously created by public policy. And it was not planned, but it was adapted and policies were improvised. And there was a vision of higher prosperity and quality of life for the citizens of North Carolina that carried through for decades and across changes in political administrations. How can I tell you this in a few minutes? So I decided I would tell you a tale of two states. And so many times when we want to predict the future, the best thing we can do is to look to the past. Sorry, Jess, I'm going to rag on Mississippi. And so, you know, for a lot of the first half of the 20th century, Mississippi and North Carolina were neck and neck in economic indicators. And really, in the 1930s, and these are industrial ads that appeared in magazines. This comes from the wonderful work of James C. Cobb and Connie Lester, where they have looked at the strategies of the state of Mississippi, which was about industrial incentives, and it was about low wages. It was pro-growth. Any job is a good job, okay? And when we look forward, where's Mississippi now in the United States pecking order? Still the lowest per capita income. Despite these efforts, this strategy did not really pay off. And it seems to me it's kind of the strategy where we've been talking about most recently in North Carolina, unfortunately. What did North Carolina do at the time? This is an ad from some of the literature for the Research Triangle Park. And again, what they're selling is the skilled labor and high technology intensive industries that are operating within the state. And really there was a decision that was made to try to restructure the state towards more technology-based industries, to build capacity, to build superb research universities, but also to have good community colleges and good high school programs. And so it is something that I think has really paid off. Now, the Research Triangle Park by itself is really not enough to explain the lift in income and growth in the state. So certainly one of the most innovative things, and North Carolina was at the forefront of this, were experimentations with public-private partnerships. When the Research Triangle Park was initiated, it was a for-profit venture, and it went belly up. And when it did, the state recognized the potential, and they stepped in with the kind of resources that the public sector can bring to bear for massive problems. They created a 501c3 that has done very well. They didn't stop there. Entities like the Biotech Center, right, which really created programs that made it easier for people to start new firms and to really understand what biotechnology was about. And this was very inclusive in terms of creating a labor force. Nicola has written about the impact on workers in biomanufacturing. And so this was a very successful strategy. I think also North Carolina was benefited from the early adoption of interstate banking. And you might say that that is deregulation, but anybody who says that is absolutely wrong, because over 2 decades, policies that were crafted that made it easier, that relaxed the strictures that prevented banking from being restricted to counties and states, and really allowed us to have the interconnected ATMs and banking systems that we benefit from. And so that was really using public policy in a very constructive way. And then a lot of my focus is entrepreneurship. And there's wonderful scholarship by Matt McCrory. Matt, our colleague who is at Duke here.
Matt McCorkle.
Matt McCorkle, thank you. Wow. Don't tell him that. I'm a little nervous, but Matt McCorkle's research shows that there's this long entrepreneurial tradition in North Carolina. And it goes back to people starting textile mills and starting furniture factories at a time when Mississippi wasn't sort of conceptualizing its economy in the same way. So the success of High Point is really due to a lot of people who had the ideas to start firms. And I want to talk about some work that Brent has been doing, looking at fast-growing firms. And so there are these fast-growing firms in 88 out of the 100 North Carolina counties. So these are firms that by and large are older. They're in a variety of different sectors, but they are creating employment opportunities throughout the state and doing it by being privately held companies. I have a colleague, Alex Grady-Reed, who did a survey of organizations in North Carolina. And what we observe is that we want to talk about for-profits and not-for-profits, but that's a really false dichotomy because we see a lot of movement in the middle. So for-profits are now adapting more progressive employment standards. They're more involved with their local communities. And also, traditional not-for-profits are now looking for additional revenue streams so that they are engaging in profit-making activities. What we see is this whole continuum of practice. Alex's work demonstrated that as a result of the 2008 recession, a lot of local employers in North Carolina communities increased their employment benefits, offering more benefits to their employees, and also engaging more with their local communities. So arguably trying to fill the void that public sector retrenchment left. Now this sounds like a great thing, except that there are tax code provisions that have been done away with that make it more difficult for firms to engage in this kind of activity. And so I'm a great believer that within local communities we have local champions who take responsibility for areas and who really help to create the conditions that make those areas prosperous. And I think it is this vision of having a prosperous community, having a high quality of life that becomes very instrumental. And so, excuse me, we've been asking the question of what is economic development? And arguably it's something that we talk about a lot, but we never really define. And unfortunately, with the lack of a definition, there is a tendency to conflate economic growth, where economic growth is simply an increase in aggregate output, with economic development. And they're really very, very different things. So if we focus on economic growth, well, we can get jobs. We can get increased output, but we may not get the prosperity that we really care about. We may not get sort of, if you will, think of economic development as putting us on a higher growth trajectory. So we have come up with this definition, working with the Economic Development Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so it seems to me, so when we look at policies, we ought to say, is this policy leading to a sustained increase in prosperity? Is it expanding capacities to realize the potential of individual firms and communities? We never know which economic agents are going to give us the ability to create new products, new processes. And then also we're going to achieve economic development through innovation, through lowering transaction costs, and through utilizing our capabilities towards the production of goods and services. think most importantly, if we want economic development, we need effective institutions that are going to be grounded in norms of openness, appreciation for diversity, and then confidence in both mutual public and private sector gains. Thank you.
And now,
Thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I want to thank the Justice Center and the SNCF for making this possible. What I'd like to do in this discussion, and it's wonderful it's happening at the Sanford School because Harry Sanford got it, perhaps we'll get it eventually as well, is talk about what I consider the real problems North Carolina faces and how we're dodging them. We're looking for very simple policies to address a couple different dimensions of problems. So what I'd like to do is, the first part, as an economist, I feel I have to show graphs. So there'll be a couple of graphs at the beginning. We'll go through those quickly, just to illustrate what I see as the problems. We'll begin with the symptoms of the problem: persistent unemployment, falling household income, rising poverty rate. These all characterize our state. This is the state we live in. Diagnosis: I have my own diagnosis. It may differ from what you'll hear from Raleigh. And finally, treatment or mistreatment. I would say the treatment is the rational way to do it. Mistreatment, we'll talk about that a bit. Symptoms: persistent unemployment. Let me begin just by describing the United States as a whole. This is a picture of the ratio of employment to population. It's not the unemployment rate, but rather the employment rate over time. And you can see that it started out rather high, and in recent years it's dropped a bit. Now, where do you think North Carolina goes compared to that? I'll give you a chance to form that picture in your head. We're red. We're a red state. What you'll notice about this is that North Carolina has been above average in unemployment, or in employment, up until 1997. Since then, employment has been falling and is now well below the average for the U.S. as a whole. So this is what I'm going to describe as one of our structural problems. We've become a high unemployment state, or a low employment state. Partly due to policies, partly due to other changes in our economy. So that's the first point, unemployment. Second, falling household income. Let's do the same exercise. This is the United States. You can see median household income in the United States going up and down during recessions, up during recoveries. Where is North Carolina?
It's not
Yeah, well, 1997 actually turns out to be a very good year, because that was the point where we almost caught up on average. But since then, you can see that we've been in decline. Our median household income has been falling throughout this period. The rest of the country, especially since 2007, has not been doing that well. But North Carolina leads the nation in this decline. Third point, rising poverty rate. Here's poverty in the United States. You can see it's been increasing over time. 1999 turned out to be a very good year for the United States as a whole. Where is North Carolina? It's above. We almost caught up in 1999. But since then, the gap has been widening. So poverty in North Carolina and the U.S. Okay, 3 symptoms. Diagnosis. This is how I would see it. We have 2 things overlaid here. We have a slow recovery from the Great Recession. I wanted to make it a little bit shorter, so I took out some of the graphs for you. But if you look, employment in North Carolina just this last, maybe January, is up to the same level it was at the end of 2006. So if you started 2006 and draw a line, we finally got as many people employed as at that time. Of course, we've had population growth, so this is not getting us back to where we were before, despite the unemployment rate changes that we've observed. So we're in a slow recovery from that recession. It's taken us this long just to get back. in terms of employment. In addition, we have the structural roadblocks to growth, and those, I think, are indicated by the fact that the employment to population ratio is much below the rest of the country, and has fallen much more than we've observed in the rest of the country. People are not finding the jobs that they used to find, and so we have to address that.
Can you speak up, please?
Okay? Now, final point, treatment and mistreatment. The first point I would make is, I think this will be shared by most economists, first, do no harm. Now, if you look at what we've observed from the state legislature, you'd have to say, well, there is quite a bit of harm done there. We've turned down the opportunity to expand Medicaid. So one insurance program that we did not choose to buy into. And the second was the removal of unemployment insurance for many of our citizens just at a time when it was very important to them. So first, do no harm, I believe we've missed the boat on that. We had insurance programs in place, we did not choose to take advantage of them. The mistreatment, I'd say, would be, this seems to be a policy of let's get the government out of the way. But in fact, during a recession, during a time of austerity, that's exactly when you need the government to be in the way, providing that insurance. It's a shame that we get so stuck in the idea of unemployment benefits, as if benefits were some sort of giveaway. They aren't. It's an insurance program, and we unilaterally canceled that insurance for many of the people who we have in our state. So first, do no harm. I think we could have done this much differently for the crisis or the downturn we're currently in. Second, provide the right incentives. What incentives have we provided as a state? Well, we cut the unemployment insurance tax. We cut taxes mostly on the wealthy. We are recruiting industries and providing subsidies. Jess is going to be able to talk about that one. We've been cutting environmental regulation, environmental expenditures. Those have been the incentives. I don't think they've been the right incentives. One of the things that I would stress is the incentives we provide to teachers to build their skills. But we've taken away that added payment that we give to teachers if they get a master's, for example. What about workforce development in the community colleges? We have not been pushing that either. These are places where we could actually improve the situation of the state by providing the right incentives. We have not been doing that, I would argue. Third, invest. And invest is a word that we don't hear very often in the current climate in Raleigh. But investment is the way that you deal with the structural roadblocks we have. Investment is a way to both increase output through a type of stimulus, and at the same time, create the preconditions for growth into the future. What type of investment might we be talking about? Workforce development, that's investment in the long-term unemployed. There's so many people who have left the labor force, not just because unemployment insurance is not available. They started leaving long before that. They left when their manufacturing jobs disappeared and they were not qualified for another job. Creating those qualifications, creating that training, that I would say would be one type of investment. Infrastructural investments, this is the sort of thing that Obama did talk about in terms of the stimulus. Investing in quality education. That would certainly be a good investment in the state of North Carolina and its citizens. Let me stop there. We've got a problem, we've got the symptoms in front of us, we've got a diagnosis. Ours will differ, I think, a great deal from what we hear in Raleigh. And then we have the treatment. And I think we have something very important that we could say as a group about that.
Thank
Fantastic. So I think we just have a little time for questions. So why don't I, as a favor to the moderator, I'll cut my remarks a little bit short and look forward to the interactive Q&A. So as decided or discussed at the beginning, I worked at the White House from 2010 to 2011. So most of my expertise is federal economic policy, but I'd like to talk a little bit about my home state, North Carolina, and where I see some of the trends going at the state level as well. First thing is, if you study the economy, you're an economist, and you go to a cocktail party, the first question everyone asks you is, where's the stock market going, right? And of course, everybody knows, if you know an economist, you know that's the worst question to ask us, because we have no idea. And I always feel like I let people down when I'm not able to give them a good stock tip and just tell them about my boring investment strategy, which turns out saving a lot of money and investing in mutual funds. But it's not about financial advice today, it's about the North Carolina economy. So the next question that they ask is, what do you think of the economy here in North Carolina? And I think that one of the things I want to bring out is, we don't just have one economy in North Carolina right now. And Maryann's work has actually, inspired me a lot to think about this, right? But, we're a lot of different kinds of regions, even in this state, right? So thinking about one North Carolina economy probably masks a lot of interesting variation. When I worked in DC, we would get these unemployment numbers every month, and those numbers would either go up or they'd go down. But what would be interesting to look at is how the unemployment rate changed for different kinds of people in different parts of the country, right? The average unemployment rate might be going down, for example. But if you look at people with less than a college degree or less than a high school degree, you might find a very different trend. And I always found those kinds of differences very interesting, and not ones that are always amenable to public debate. And we'll come up with this later, but the headline's always going to be the North Carolina unemployment rate is 6.7%, whatever it might be in the January reading, right? John will know the right answer, right? But the idea here is that masks a lot of heterogeneity across our different regions in North Carolina. So go to different parts of our state and you'll see a very different economic reality, right? And so I think wherever you are on the political spectrum, I think you'll recognize those differences. So if you ask a young person in the Triangle region, which is booming, right, has a very low unemployment rate, I think probably about 5.5%, the recent reading might have been updated, right? The outlook for a person with a college degree or advanced degree could be really, really good. This is a great place to come start a company, do innovation, go to school, and not everyone has a success story, but there's a lot of positive things in this area, and that's been a general uptrend for a long time. People with high education, for example, and that's relatively true about some of our other metro regions, right? Whether it's the Triad or in Charlotte, right? But if you look at our rural counties, which again, right, we're about 80 out of our 100 counties in our state, the economic picture is much different, and it's been that way for quite some time. So you'll see quite higher rates of unemployment in our rural areas as a general rule, and you'll see less education on average for the people who live there. And what that leads to, I think, if you look at the context of the broader economy, is a really troubling dynamic. So as the broader economy is one where people with higher education are increasingly reaping more of the gains, and people in urban areas with large agglomerations of people where they can do things like start companies and network with people like them and go to great universities, those gains are getting more and more apparent in urban areas with highly educated people. And of course, if you have rural areas who don't have those resources, you're going to see big cleavages, right? And that's what you're seeing in North Carolina. So people ask me how North Carolina is doing, and I said, well, from the point of view of the Triangle, things can be very positive, right? And this is a great place to live and do the things that you might want to do. In other parts of the state, it's been a lot harder. And I think, again, wherever you are on the political spectrum, it's really important to try to figure out what your policy response is going to be to that. So let me just delve a little bit into the two things that I think are important, which is education and geography. And also before, just mention that, who you ask around the state really depends on where they sit and what they do, right? So if you talk to a business leader, go down to the American Underground, talk to a high-tech entrepreneur. You ask them, what's the most important policy initiative that we should be pursuing at the national or state level? They likely, my experience, having done a lot of these discussions and done tours for the White House and other places, is that they'll tell you something about STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, or immigration reform, which is more of a national policy issue, but of course affects our state. And that's really interesting, right? Why do they care about that? They care about that because they have a lot of trouble hiring engineers, and they think that we don't have enough people who are trained to do the job, and they would love to see more immigrants from other countries who are getting trained in this stuff come and be able to work here. That's what they care about, okay? That's why they want it. Of course, they may also have a moral sentiment towards sort of more immigration, thinking that's a good thing to have a more diverse country, but the bottom line for a business leader usually tends to be about sort of access to human capital. If you ask a CEO or someone who works at a food processing company in Eastern North Carolina, you might get a very different answer in terms of what they think the most important priority is. When you talk to people who are in businesses that have low margins, you tend to get answers about taxation and regulation. Why? Because those are important issues that affect their bottom line, right? Much more maybe than the access to labor issue. So just want to remind people again, I mean, it's easy to have conversations like that with all these high-tech entrepreneurs and to include what business wants is immigration reform or STEM policy, and they do indeed want those things. But talking to lots of people from different business environments, which also employ people, you might get different answers. And that's at least what I've seen when I've gone to Greenville or Greensboro or Charlotte or Asheville, including the Triangle. So a few things on education. When we were at the White House, one of the things we did was try to make college completion a national priority. The U.S. used to lead the world in college completion. Now we're somewhere in the middle of the pack, and that's been something that's concerned, again, people on all parts of the political spectrum, and the business community especially. In fact, they were the ones usually who were coming to us with this first and foremost as a key need. North Carolina is probably right in the middle, 25th in 2009 data when it comes to college completion rate. So the percentage of our citizens who have a college degree is in 2009 is, I think, in the neighborhood of 26, 27% right there. So we're right in the middle. And the question you have to ask yourself is, at the state level, are the policies being instituted today and over the next couple of years going to be one that are going to move up that list or down that list or be stagnant? Because a lot of the economic research seems to indicate the higher we can get on that list, the more people we have with college-ready skills and degrees, the better we're going to be as an economy. And it's not just about training our own people, it's also about attracting college sort of degree holders to our state, which we've done a really good job of over the last generation. So when you think about those policies, you can't just start the first day of freshman year at UNC or Duke or Greensboro or Wake Forest. It starts all the way back in elementary school, right? Because we know you can't make someone college ready just from the first day of class on freshman year. So then the question is, what kind of teachers are in the classrooms, right? In the public schools where, let's say, 90% of the children are going to be. So some of the educational initiatives at the state level, whether it's the way we're thinking about teacher tenure, teacher pay and bonuses, the proliferation of charter schools, those are the kind of policy questions that people need to ask themselves about how it's going to affect the education system all the way up to college completion. And that's something I think is incredibly important for economic prosperity in North Carolina. One interesting point here is, again, the business community is very engaged in this. As a business school professor, I talk to a lot of business leaders, and if you ask them, education is usually at the top of their list, and not just in the RTP, but all around. Again, there's moral issues here too, but there's also the issue of going to get workers to be able to do the jobs of the 21st century and fill those jobs. So there's a lot of sentiments, I think, in common ground. And I also want to make this point, framing. The speakers before me did a wonderful job of explaining how economics can be reframed, right, to make different points. Remember, framing isn't just useful for winning a message war. Framing is useful for finding common ground with people who may disagree with you on other things. And I think there's a lot of common ground on these issues like education as well. The other thing I want to say is, you can't just imagine a world where everyone has a college degree and a high-tech job, right? Going around the country speaking about this stuff, you'll always get that question, and someone will come up and say, look, I'm a 55-year-old textile worker, and that's not just North Carolina, other places. What are you telling me I need to do? Go back to school for 3 years to get a degree and then work 10 more years at a job? What's the solution for me? And frankly, we'd like to pretend we have all the answers out there. A lot of our workforce training programs haven't worked that well. We need to figure out new models to get folks like that back in the workforce, and it might not be the traditional college path. So at the same time we're thinking about high-tech jobs, we almost have to do this jiu-jitsu to also think about jobs in the middle and lower part of the income spectrum, especially the middle part. The hollowing out that a lot of economists have talked about is a real thing. And where are those jobs going to be? Previously, they were in industries like manufacturing. Today, they might be more in industries like healthcare, education, maybe construction. All those, to the points made by my previous speakers, have big government components. So if you think about where the demand for home health aides, nurses, assistants, tutors, educational administrators, construction workers is going to come from, often there are big federal and state investments in things like infrastructure, healthcare, education. So the future of kind of those middle jobs is something to really watch for at the federal and state level, and that's the part of the economy that's kind of been hollowed out. In North Carolina, we still have 400,000 workers in manufacturing. So don't let anyone tell you we don't have manufacturing in North Carolina. In fact, we're quite productive. The manufacturing sector in the United States is as productive as it's ever been, right? So the fact we shouldn't really say we don't make things. We make a lot of things, just honestly with less workers, and that's the reality of what we're doing today. Also, agriculture is still a huge part of the economy in terms of number of employees. But again, right, automation, technology, and lifestyle choices are changing sort of labor participation in those industries. So those are things to think about when thinking about the other side of the economy. Not everyone's going to get a college degree and a PhD and a high-tech job, and we shouldn't necessarily assume that. In geography, Mike Wallman and NC State has said this, I think it's great, 75% or 70-75% of the job growth in the last 3 years has come from the 3 metro areas. So if you're talking about job growth in North Carolina, again, it's quite an urban-rural divide. So we should celebrate those successes and all the things we've done, but we really haven't found a way, I think, to crack those issues in the rural areas. Maryann gave us a great example of ERTP as maybe not one that wasn't sort of a command and control style development, but it was planned in a very real way, and her research and others have shown that. I think that we need to think hard about how we're going to have rural development strategies. The problems of the Rural Development Center have kind of brought this to the foray for different reasons, but the idea is like, how can we build, is it place-based strategies, which many economists frankly are very cynical about, right? Because they see industrial policy, inefficiency, and waste. Or is it something about giving people other incentives, investing in people, right? And then letting them do what they want to do, whether it's moving out of the region or starting a company in that region. Those are two very different ways of thinking about it. One is investing in people, agnostic of place, and the other one's investing in places. And whether, again, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, thinking about which ones of those policies you support and why is incredibly important. Because to me, that's one of the big puzzles in North Carolina. Just to end, before we get to the Q&A, the 2 or 3 things people have been talking about here when I go to DC or New York is the Medicaid expansion and the lack thereof, the long-term unemployment issues, and then the third one is our tax issue. To me, the tax one is by far the most important, and let me tell you why I think that is. The Medicaid expansion isn't a final choice. Many states are 25 or so have opted out, but a lot of states are still considering it, and that decision hasn't been totally made as far as we can tell. Now, during this term, the short session, it seems like business leaders are going to focus more on reforming the Medicaid program as is, which is what Governor Corey want to do. But that doesn't mean that we can't do the Medicaid expansion later on. So while that's an important issue, I don't think it's been finalized to the best of my knowledge, and I think that there's potential benefits that come from that. Second, on the long-term unemployment issue, I mean, that's actively being debated in Congress right now about the future of that program. So that's another one that's very important, has an impact on our state that I feel strongly about, but not necessarily settled, okay? The tax structure one is very interesting, though, because I think that's the one that has the most potential to affect our state in the long term, in my personal opinion. By bringing down personal tax rates to a flat rate, by bringing down corporate tax rates as low as 5% and maybe lower depending on revenue targets, you're really changing the way we raise money to pay for these types of investments we're talking about. And so it's appropriate that we're in the house of Terry Sanford to think about what's the playbook going forward. But the Sanford-Hunt playbook in North Carolina and the Martin playbook and across the political spectrum was these investments in education, but also bringing along business and partnerships to go with it. But also, a lot of the trade-offs that are going to be apparent going forward, as Matt McCorkle will tell you, weren't necessarily these big issues. You could do a huge teacher raise without raising taxes, okay? Nowadays, when the revenue structure changes and that pie gets smaller, all of a sudden you think about these investments in a new light, then Maryann's work on public-private partnerships become a lot more important. So if you're a person who thinks we need big public investments, the new revenue structure is going to really change the way we think about that. And so I think that's probably by design, right? And so I think that that's an important thing to grapple with going forward is what's that playbook going to be for people who want to invest in innovation, education, and infrastructure? Because the budget realities are going to be much, much different than they were when Terry Sanford and Governor Hunt and Governor Martin and other folks across the aisles were in power. So I'll stop there and we can all take questions.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to invoke my privilege and sort of raise 2 questions that I think were addressed across people and sort of get some response and then open it up. Okay. The first one is that across a lot of people's remarks, this idea whether it's the people who are going to choose not to work under the Affordable Care Act or the failure of Medicaid expansion or unemployment payments being cut or minimum wage being raised, all of these programs implicitly are selling growth from the lowest productive sectors of the economy. They're saying that Google doesn't have a problem hiring people because unemployment transfers are too high. It doesn't have a problem hiring people because minimum wage may get set too high, or the other sort of high growth firms across state. So why do you think there is a focus when clearly the growth of the country seems to be, the strongest part of the growth of the country is from the faster growing, higher wage jobs, more productive industrial jobs even, that there is this focus on growth coming from squeezing productivity out of that part of the distribution? And is there a way you think you would prefer to reframe things to make people see that or try and change that policy?
It's a good question. I guess I have a hard time almost taking it seriously in the sense, not your question, but I mean the claim that that anyone really believes you're going to get growth by by cutting unemployment benefits. I mean, I understand that's what they say, but I guess I just go, the evidence is so overwhelming the opposite direction. So I guess I have to say I think it's more kind of a punitive thing. We're going to kick these people and because we don't like them. Because they say, when could these people be so oblivious of the evidence? I mean, that's really the question. I just find it hard to believe that they are. So I almost see it as, the growth. I mean, that's what they say because it doesn't. No politician wants to get up and say we're going to kick these people. So it's it's going to be for their own good. So I really have to say, I think that's really rationalization. I just have a hard time believing that that's actually what they think they do. They're doing.
Okay, so the last other question would be about, and again, a lot of people touched on this, going back to the idea of the scarcity, that there's this notion that in absolute crisis, we can have the government do something. But when things are bad, and if things are good, maybe we can let the government do things. When things are just bad, the government shouldn't do things. And so that spending on transfers for unemployment insurance or support for people or investments in infrastructure for poor people are sort of a luxury good in our economy and something that we can only afford to spend on in the good times, while again, the evidence seems that exactly the opposite is true. Do you think that there's a way that we can, or a program you think that would be sellable as an idea, something you do work on?
Well, in times of recession, the clear answer is increased demand, and only the government can do it. As Dean pointed out, it seems to me that the right policy may be too small, but the right policy was fought at the federal level, but the teacher-in-chief didn't do a good job of selling it. Instead, literally Herbert Hoover kind of interpretation came along that, well, the right thing to do is to tighten your belt, deficits which are implied by doing the right federal policy, but the interpretation became, well, deficits themselves are stunting growth and are mortgaging the future. So it's very much a case of teaching and interpretation. And given the history of things, I'm not too optimistic.
Let me mention one thing that I think can bridge the divide to some extent, and there's some Republican support. There actually considerable Republican support for the idea of work sharing. That the idea is, as you look at our unemployment system now, you're basically subsidizing layoffs. So if I'm an employer and my demand falls and I have to cut back production by 20%, I know if I lay off these workers, I lay off 20% of my workforce, they can go get unemployment insurance, get half pay. But if I say, well, I'd really like to keep people employed, but I want to cut their hours by 20% because I don't need them full-time. Well, I don't get that. We don't get the unemployment insurance. So the idea of work sharing is, okay, let's make that symmetric. So let's say, okay, if you cut back hours by 20%, your workers are going to work 20% fewer hours. We're going to give them half pay if they're going to be totally unemployed. Now they're 20% unemployed. Let's make up half that. So they'll work 20% fewer hours. They'll get 10% less pay. That's something I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, better to stay at full employment, but given you're facing a shortfall in demand, much better to meet that with this work sharing system than laying people off. And that has had Republican support, basically with that logic. And the model here, of course, is Germany, which has used this with great effect. A lot of people point to Germany. Their unemployment rate today is 5.2%. It's the most recent number, might be a little bit higher or lower, but anyhow, roughly 5.2. And a lot of people look at that and go, oh, Germany's got this booming economy. No, Germany's economy has actually grown somewhat less than the U.S. economy since the downturn. Now, they do have slower population growth, so that helps them. But the point is, they haven't grown any faster. They've grown a little bit slower. The reason why their unemployment rate is so low, and in fact is lower than it was at the start of the downturn, their employment rate's higher too, so if we took the other side, it's not playing games here. Employment rates actually increased substantially, is that they've managed to get firms to keep people on the job. So they've responded to shortfalls in demand by cutting back hours. Part of it is a formal work sharing. Some is they have a very heavily unionized workforce, so it's labor management agreements. There's some other issues there. But the point is they've dealt with the downturn, keeping people at work, and employers appreciate that because their expectation is that at some point they're going to need these people. They're going to see an increase in demand. They're not going to have to go out and look for new hires and train workers. They're right there. So that is, I think, an alternative way to deal with this that can be politically viable. And the nice thing about that, it actually can be done at the state level. I think North Carolina has work sharing. There's 25 states in the country. North Carolina. You don't have it? Okay, we got it. And one of the good parts of that story is the federal government, because it is bipartisan, they actually pick up the tab for the program through the end of this year. Maybe it'll be extended, but they actually, so insofar as you can get workers, instead of employers having people on UI, have them on work sharing, that's a cost that the state doesn't have to bear. That'll be picked up by the federal government.
Your question also just sort of gets to the fundamental view Americans have of their government, right? Which is question beyond the scope of this panel, but maybe appropriate for political scientists, psychologists, and economists, and lots of different people to opine on. A couple of data points on that. There was a really interesting survey in 2010. The New York Times published some results. It might have been a collaboration with another polling agency, but they asked Americans, do you receive a government benefit? And they actually stratified the data to look at people who actually did receive benefits and see what they said. And it turned out for many of these benefits, whether it's veteran benefits or 529 plan, all the implicit and explicit subsidies that we get from the government and direct benefits, many people reported in some of those categories more than 40 or 50% that they didn't receive anything from the government. And so maybe the government's done a really good job of sort of disguising itself as it does these things, and maybe that's part of the issue. But then the failures are very visible, right? When things don't work or people are upset because a website doesn't work or there's a loan to a failed company, you see that, right? But then some of the implicit and explicit transfers are a little bit harder to detect. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about here, because many things the government does, harkens back to the famous, keep your government hands off my Medicare, idea, which is that, maybe it's worked too well in that sense. So I think that's one thing to think about. I also think it's important to think at a very tactical level of how people interact with government in their daily lives. For many people, when you ask them about government, they think about going to the DMV, which is not necessarily federal government function. So just remember that when you say government, or when I say government, it doesn't necessarily mean what we might think it is. And attitudes that people express about these things might have to do with sort of very day-to-day things and not their impression of a particular program like Medicare, Social Security, or whatever it might be, which are very popular in all polls. So
we have these ideological debates about, are people lazy and will they not work if they have unemployment? But it seems to me we have a political party, Republicans are talking about family values, right? And they want to promote healthy families. Yet we have no parental leave or maternity leave. And that is just something as we think about Europe, that, we ought to sort of say, wait, this speaks to your values. And think about all the jobs you would create if you gave every parent a year off, and what that might do for, for the stability of families, blah, 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 which is the rhetoric that we hear. So I think, that if we can sort of turn this around to get things that we believe would be beneficial, that might be the way to, to move forward, perhaps.
And that can be done at the state level too.
That can be done at the state level.
And has been.
Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
All right, let's open it up to the audience if anyone has. Start here.
Being a native Mississippian, I think I have the right. I'm Jesse White. Grew up in Mississippi and came to North Carolina because it was such a progressive state, and now I'm beginning to wonder if I should go back home. But
It's coming to you.
it's come to me. But I'm glad Maryann did the presentation she did. There are a couple of points I'd like to make. One is the tale of two states is true. But to me, as a political scientist, the most important thing that happened is that in 1959, Mississippi elected Ross Barnett governor. And in 1960, North Carolina elected Terry Sanford governor. And that's where you really see, Mississippi was obsessed with segregation. It was just a horrendous 30 years. North Carolina was a little progressive. So politics clearly matters big time. And the other thing I'm glad Maryann brought up is the interstate banking. I think that's probably an underreported story about the economic development history of the state. And the interesting thing, again, that Terry Sanford did was lead in the creation of an organization called the Southern Growth Policy Board. And which I headed up for 8 years. And Southern Growth was instrumental in making the interstate banking movement happen. It was led by Bob Granville, Florida, and the idea was to create this interstate compact for a limited time to get us ready for national banking, and it certainly did work. So regional institutions were very important, and sad to report that the current governor, who was the current chairman of Southern Growth Policy Board, led to its abolition about 6 months ago. So just wanted to weigh in with those 2 points.
I would just say a couple of things. I mean, think one thing people sometimes forget when we talk about some of these economic policy issues is that sometimes you have to think about who you're talking to in a way. So I mean, I think you get out to more the general public, or even with a lot of elected officials and policymakers, there is a lot of bad economic thinking out there. You know, somebody sat in a class once 30 years ago and saw a supply and demand curve that said the minimum wage kills jobs, and that's what they go with. Or they think the whole world works like some guy's muffler shop, and so just want and so that's how the economy works. So there's a lot of that sort of misinformation out there. I mean, I think a second problem is that there is a tremendous amount of, especially among policymakers, confusion about economic data. Sometimes I think that's very deliberately stoked, but even something like employment data, no one knows. I was at an event recently with one of our local Congress people, and he really didn't know what the unemployment rate actually was. So I think these concepts people don't know. There's a lot of emphasis to sort of monkey around with the data, especially when you have series that undergo a lot of revisions and revisements and reissues and benchmarking. So people lose sight of what's actually happening, and you can tell a story about anything. I mean, I think the third thing, just to keep in mind when we're having these conversations, or why some of this economic research doesn't penetrate, is at least at the state level, the political structure, the way we elect folks, the way districts are set up, really do give a lot of privilege to a lot of those lower wage, low margin businesses. Those folks tend to be a lot more influential at the local level than some of the big multinational tech companies, and it's their voices that get heard a lot. In your average, in a lot of the local district, you hear that often from Google, but you probably do hear from your local car dealers every time you turn around. So I think there are those factors in mind that we have to think about, not just sort of the message or the economic research or what it shows, but also who you're talking to and what some of the structures are that are pushing back on policies.
Well, I was going to say that as part of this restructuring, the North Carolina Department of Economic Development, they have dropped all their analytic capabilities. And so they are required to collect certain data, but they're not, they've lost that. They don't have any ability now to analyze it. And so again, this is shocking. If you just think that, the sort of free, markets work well when they have more information. Yet we have a party that believes in markets but doesn't want the information out there.
I was going to say a bit about the misinformation thing, because I think that is hugely important. I really blame the media a lot for this, because their reporting is absolutely horrible. And I'll just mention a couple of places. Budget reporting, and it's absolutely standard. That you'll see budget reporting. We're going to spend whatever, it was roughly $1 trillion on the agriculture bill over the next decade. Now, if you go and look at the reporting on that, I'm talking the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, I mean some small town paper, half the time they don't even tell you that's over 10 years. Furthermore, no one knows what $1 trillion is over a decade. No one does. 1% of the people have their nose in the budget. Probably not even that. And I mean, I understand New York Times readers are well-educated people. They don't spend their time reading the budget, so they're not giving them any information. Now, a really simple thing that they could do, well, $1 trillion, the budget over the next decade, somewhere around $40 trillion, so you can say, well, that's around 2% of projected spending. You've told people information. There is no one who works for the New York Times who can't figure out how to turn, a number into a percentage, and if they can't, then shouldn't be reporting on economic issues. That's real simple. I've raised this with the reporters. Not one budget reporter has ever tried to tell me that any significant percentage of their readership understands those numbers. Yet that persists. I raised this, I thought I had a big victory. The public editor at the New York Times, great person, Margaret Sullivan, wrote about this. She took it up with their national editor at the Times, David Leonhardt. He agreed completely, actually used my words. He said, just saying a really big number. So he said, we're going to put numbers in context. Go read it today. Same thing. It's just unbelievable. I mean, it really is amazing. Everyone knows it makes no sense to change it. I'm not telling them to spend years researching. This is something that would take someone 2 seconds. I know they're busy. I know they're on deadlines. They aren't that busy. They aren't that often on deadlines. It's just astounding. And, I think it is hugely important because, you look at things and polls regularly find this. People think 30% of the budget goes to TANF. If I thought 30% of the budget went to TANF, I'd want to cut 2 because that's a lot of money and you don't have much to show for it. People hugely overestimate the amount of money that they think half, the other half goes to foreign aid. The actual numbers something like, 1/3 of 1%. And for TANF, by the way, it's about 0.6%. That's a ballpark number. So, I mean, give you an idea. So, I mean, that's a huge important thing, shapes people's views. The other, in terms of the economic data that comes out, they don't know what the unemployment rate is. Again, I blame reporters a lot for this stuff. They don't, you have people reporting on this stuff, they should know. I'm thinking again, the big papers, the NPR. Consumer confidence number came out yesterday and it went up a lot. And this is one of the things I wanted to get my baseball bat out. But what are you talking about? It's like, oh, big deal, big deal. Consumer confidence has two components. One of them is a future expectations index. They say, what does the economy look like 6 months from now? The other one is current conditions. If you look at what has any relationship to what people are actually doing, are they buying cars, buying houses, whatever, current conditions has some relevance. Future expectations is nothing. Future expectations is What that should mean is that no one should pay any attention to future expectations. The big jump yesterday was in future expectations. Current conditions actually fell slightly. So this is someone who's reporting and that should know that. They don't. And so, we can blame, and I do blame the politicians, they should know this too, but, the people who are doing, it's their job to be reporting this and conveying the information, they're utterly clueless half the time.
Or they're looking for a sensational story, right? They're looking for news.
Yeah, well, they should be whacked for it. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, their editor, someone should be saying, what did you tell us? What was your story telling us? Did that have anything to do with the world?
In the same vein, I can't help but mention this. Politicians, particularly during campaigns, when you're talking about unemployment rates, will cite statistics as though as an expose. Well, the official unemployment rate is this, but really if you add the, part-time workers and so on, and they treat it like an expose and somebody's hiding something, though the Labor Department gives as many definitions of unemployment as the Fed must give of different types of money supply. So, but no reporter ever comes out with this. There's no expose. If you want to track whatever definition you want, you can go back through history and track it. Again, it's like it's an expose and the government's done something wrong with its official definition. They've printed all the other definitions.
We have a very tangible problem right now in that our unemployment rate has gone down because workers have discouraged workers. And politicians are taking credit. Politicians are taking credit for the fact that the unemployment rate has gone down when it's a statistical artifact. It's really not based on anything. And so, I mean, what do we do right now as we see this number? I mean, so you can just imagine that things are much better, right, for the next election. And how do we grade those reports?
Employment rate.
Yes.
I'm Mary B. McMillan with the North Carolina AFL-CIO. And from the labor perspective, the fundamental economic problem is that workers no longer share in the fruits of their labor. And we are in this global race to the bottom to see which companies can make the most by paying workers the least. And that is immoral. It's wrong, and the most important thing is it doesn't have to be that way. If we restored workers' right to organize and collectively bargain, we could create an economy that works for everyone. If you look at that chart with declining unionization rates, it charts right along with declining share of middle-class income. Unions create shared prosperity, and so I have to admit I get really frustrated when I hear progressives talk about poverty and inequality and they don't mention labor rights. So I'd like to hear the panel talk about unions and their role in the economy, and also how do we shift the paradigm so that people understand that what's good for workers is good for business?
Well, I think, the causes of growing inequality and, the fact that workers haven't shared in wage gains, there's a lot of them. But yeah, I mean, the declining unionization is very dramatic, and it's been a very big part. So private sector unionization rate was around 20% back in 1980. Today it's less than 7%. I mean, it's really just plummeted. And that's hugely weakened workers' bargaining power, workers' ability to share in any gains for productivity growth. And I'd love to see that reversed. Unfortunately, we've gotten very anti-labor policies, and it's you know, it's just standard practice now for employers to fire union organizers. I mean, there's any number of management consultants, they have books on this, and they just say, oh, you have someone organizing a union, fire. It's against the law, but the sanctions are a joke. I mean, I have friends who talk about the National Labor Relations Board as being children's court. Because, and I'm saying it a little facetiously, but the point is, when something goes the other way, when you know, there's restrictions on what unions can do, things they can do. So they can't do a secondary boycott. So if the Teamsters set up a picket line, you know, if your cafeteria workers went on strike here, Teamsters wanted to support them, and they set up a picket line and say, okay, we're not gonna deliver. They'll get an injunction. Well, maybe your university won't do that, I don't know. But a lot of employers will go get an injunction that, you know, hand it to the union officers, say, you gotta tell your workers that they can't honor this picket line. Your union can't do that. And if they ignore that, well, they're gonna get arrested. They'll have their assets seized. That could happen in a day. Okay, now you flip that over, you go, okay, your cafeteria workers are trying to organize, I'll make it another employer. Cafeteria workers are trying to organize, employer goes, okay, who's involved in this? You know, they ask a few people, figure out who the leaders are, fire them, totally against the law. Okay, so they fire a case with the National Labor Relations Board. It might take 6 months, it might take a year. And then at the end of that, what do they get? Well, they get their job back, and then they get their difference in pay between what they would have gotten at their job if they stayed there and whatever alternative employment they might get. And that might be zero, might well be zero. So we set up a structure that kind of has, you know, joke sanctions for breaking the law against unions, whereas they're very real. You can go to jail, you know, when you break the law against the company. And, you know, that's a sort of environment, yeah, it's very hard to organize, and, you know, that's what we've seen. We've had a huge decline in union representation because, you know, we see jobs go away, and the new workplaces that are opening up, it's extremely difficult to organize them.
Only to echo that, I think that.
Follow on several. Why I was thinking that that about the job sharing, and was wondering about this, whether rural jobs are as amenable to job sharing as others. Like certain types of communications jobs could be done for anywhere. But I realize what we're actually seeing recently is that with the new healthcare regulations that are dropping the hours cuts those employees off of healthcare coverage.
Yeah, you know, this is, for people aren't familiar, there's a provision in the Affordable Care Act that has a 30-hour cutoff. Employers are obligated employers of more than 50 workers, obligated either to provide insurance or pay a penalty, I think it's $2,000, if they don't provide coverage for those workers. That was originally supposed to apply last year, that was supposed to apply this year. The Obama administration put that off for another year. I think the 30-hour cutoff was a foolish policy, but nonetheless, there's no evidence to date that that's actually had an impact. And, you know, the employers thought through the first 6 months of last year, employers thought it would apply for 2013. So they you know, in July 2nd, July 3rd, President Obama or some of the administration announced, you know, we're going to put that off for a year. And then I forget what it was they announced this year that they're going to put it off for another year. But in any case, for 6 months, they did think that it would apply. And we looked at the data on that. And the share of workers who are employed for less than 30 hours actually had fallen slightly. So that doesn't mean over a long term you won't see some shift that way. It would be very surprising if you did. But the idea that employers, and you know, there were a few employers who made a big point of standing up. You know, there's some guy with a pizza franchise said, "Oh, we're going to cut all our hours, everyone's hours to less than 30." I don't think they did that because you know, you know, as much as, you know, things are really tilted towards employers right now, they do still have to deal with their workers in some sense. And if you just tell everyone, okay, you've been working 35 hours, you got health care, now I'm going to have you be 29 hours. You have a lot of workers quit, and employers don't want that, you know. So the reality is there's no evidence that's happened at any significant scale. I'm sure there's someone here or there that has done that. And again, I wouldn't design the policy that way. I don't want to have cutoffs in general. That's not the way. You want to have phase outs, you want to, you know, if you did it by total hours. I mean, there's other ways to do it that don't give you that incentive. So I think that was an unfortunate thing in the act. I think the impact of it, though, is hugely exaggerated.
One more question.
I'm Mark Feldman with a local group, People's Alliance, and our bywords on what should be happening are stimulate and redistribute. Stimulate the economy to create more jobs, and then make sure those jobs pay by, among other things, restoring worker rights, the earned income tax credit, and things like that. What do you think are the best prospects federally and at the state level in either of those two realms, stimulating the economy and provisions to redistribute and make sure work pays?
Well, in terms of stimulating, I see not a lot of prospect of getting much out of the federal government. We might get some nickel and dimes. There are some things that will enjoy bipartisan support. Kind of I don't mean literally pork barrel in the sense like they're necessarily bad things, but you have a representative in your district who goes, oh yeah, I'd like a road here. I'd like my bridge. So there's some room for negotiation there, and as much as Republicans might say, well, we have to have offset, I think they're also willing to look the other way. So I think there might be some nickel and dime stuff there. It won't be big. The bigger route on stimulus, I think, would be if we saw some progress on the trade deficit, which is basically getting the dollar down. Whether that's going to happen soon, whether our administration, whether the Obama administration will take the lead on that, I don't know. When I'm saying take the lead, China's had a policy deliberately keeping its currency down against the dollar, keeping the dollar up. Their intention, their stated intention, is to move away from that. That boosted their exports, meant we had larger trade deficit. Their stated intention is to move away from that. How quickly they do that, how seriously, because obviously they have different interests there as well, I don't know, but that would be a way in which we'd see more stimulus. If we got our trade deficit down, that's jobs here, growth here. In terms of improving workers' bargaining power, there are some small things maybe the Obama administration could do. One of the things that he's talked about with contractors, government contractors, that he's going to require they pay the higher, 1010 is the minimum wage that for new contracts. He could also put some labor conditions on that too. I mean, he'll get the Republicans yelling and screaming, but he could say, for example, neutrality. Meaning that if the company doesn't take a stand saying we don't want you to unionize. If you want to unionize, again, workers' choice. They'll have to vote for it, but the company's not actively campaigning against it. That would that would be a long shot. The Obama administration will go that way, but it would certainly be a big thing. It's certainly symbolic, and there are a lot of people involved there. The other thing, of course, the minimum wage. I mean, that would be great if we can get a 10-10 minimum wage nationally. If we can get states, again, a number of states have raised their minimum wages. I think Washington State's highest are like 980, so that's my kind of the exact number. Other states are looking to raise theirs. The DC we're raising, I should know exactly what it is, but it's 10 something. So that's that's a help. I mean, obviously that's low end workers. This isn't happening. Thankfully most workers are getting more than 10 an hour. Not too much more maybe, but but that is something that can be done in the not too distant future as a political reality.
And two other things. I mean, one is just to dovetail. I mean, sometimes the political reality in the present looks very grim. So I remember when I was in DC, we were working during the lame duck session, and someone came and told us from the political side, well, nothing ever happens in lame duck sessions. And I said, well, how do you know? And they said, well, nothing's ever happened in lame duck session. Turned out that lame duck session was like the most productive that we'd ever had in 2010, where got a food safety bill, repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, this economics deal on taxes. A lot of things actually happened during lame duck session. So right now the situation looks like we're sort of set up for inaction, right? It's an election year. We know that it's probably better for both parties to kind of run on things that are popular with the base and just kind of put together resolutions that have no chance of passing, right, rather than actually work in legislation. After elections, sometimes things do change in not the ways we always expect, and sometimes lame duck sessions are more productive than you might think. So two things I'm watching in the long term are infrastructure investments. I mean, both parties talk about it in different ways. Both realize that it's incredibly important, and there's a lot of good jobs in infrastructure. The infrastructure bank and different ways to finance it kind of recall what Maryann's point about public-private partnerships has been. Also, I mean, this is more of an intellectual meta point, but the Republicans have been talking a lot more about tax credits recently, child tax credits, earned income tax credits, in some of the stuff that's come out of the different budgetary proposals. And so that's an area I'm interested to see on both sides what's going to happen. In the short term, things look really difficult at the federal level. I mean, I'm with Dean on that. It might surprise you what might happen later on, even though the cards may be shifted after 2014.
Let me say something about the state. And as we look at North Carolina, actually I'd say that North Carolina shows a bit more promise than the national even, because we do have an election coming up, and the government has until now been so negative towards the poor that some of these things could well roll in some of the tax credits, some of the spending on teacher salary and such. Typically, those are hitting the lower income groups more than the upper income groups. So I'd expect a bit more there, but I think that tagging on to something like the minimum wage or taking advantage of a federal or the Federal Reserve's effort to appreciate the exchange rate, those would both be the sort of growth that you'd be looking for, given North Carolina's history as a good exporting state. That would give the sort of economic progress at the base level that we haven't seen in recent years. Unfortunately, that when we go into a recession, it's typical here, and it's in spades true in North Carolina, that we tend to wish to rely upon ourselves more. And so we elect people who will cut our taxes, even though they will not have the funds to provide some public services that you and I would agree are necessary. So as we get that sort of growth from exports or from other non-federal stimuli, then we should see more tax revenue, more ability to spend on those. But in the short run, I'm banking on the election coming up and the government's desire to show that it's doing something.
Well, actually, we'll take one last question.
Question about, Dean, I know you've written, or you talk a lot about the NARU and full employment. I'm just wondering, in your mind, is there some way we can achieve, as a bit of a utopian question, full employment without getting runaway wage price spirals? And what does that level at? Can we really provide a job to everyone at a living wage? Is our system built for that? Or will we have this runaway inflation? Or will we have massive deficits? And do those deficits really matter? If you listen to any of the University of Missouri, Kansas City folks, they think you can spend and spend and spend until you get hit runaway inflation. Just like to get your thoughts on it.
Well, to give people context, the neighbor's idea of non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So the idea is that there's some level of unemployment. If the economy gets below that level, the inflation rate will start to accelerate, which isn't in and of itself necessarily a big deal. But if it continues to accelerate, then the idea is, we eventually have, German-style hyperinflation, and no one in the right mind would want that. So the idea is that, we have to keep the unemployment rate from falling too low, otherwise inflation gets carried away. So the question is, is there a level like that? I guess I'm agnostic about that. My view is kind of why not press this? This is something that's come up in the debate, surprisingly to me, that, you have a debate in the business press, at least I don't know, the broader people reading the business press, so I'm not always sure what I saw on the front page versus the business page, but there's a debate in the business press, the Federal Reserve Board, are we approaching sort of the floor of the unemployment rate, which I kind of find mind-boggling because it just seems so obvious to me that, we have a lot of people that need to find jobs, and, there's no evidence of inflation in the economy, so it's sort of like, what are you guys talking about? What are you looking at? Clearly we could go a lot lower, and, my view is why not keep pressing, and I'll go back to the 1990s because I think it's an interesting story there. Absolute consensus in the economics profession that the unemployment rate couldn't get below 6. I mean, some people said 5.8, 5.7, 5.6, but basically a 6% range without seeing accelerating inflation. So it wasn't just a conservative story. This was, relative liberals in the profession, people that Bill Clinton appointed to the Federal Reserve Board, like Ellen Blinder and Janet Yellen, some of you may have heard. They were absolutely convinced that the unemployment rate couldn't get below 6%. In fact, they've written about this. Janet Yellen, Lawrence Myers, another Clinton appointee, argued with Alan Greenspan in '95, saying you have to raise interest rates. The unemployment rate's getting too low. It was about 5.6 or 5.7 at the time. We're going to have inflation. And Greenspan, whatever you say about him, I've trashed him endlessly because I think not seeing the housing bubble was absolutely disastrous and paid enormous cost for it. So he doesn't rank high in my pantheon of great economists. But the one thing I give him enormous credit for was he said, I don't see any inflation. Why should I raise interest rates? Why should I slow the economy? And he was absolutely right. The unemployment rate fell 5.5%, 5%, 4.5%, 4% is a year-round average in 2000. And you really have to look at the data, you really have to beat it up to go there was an acceleration of inflation. Some series showed a very modest acceleration. But the basic story there was we got much lower rates of unemployment that almost anyone in the profession thought was possible, meant millions of people working would not have otherwise had jobs. And on top of that, this was the only time since the early 70s, where we saw sustained wage gains up and down the income ladder. So you saw people at the 10th percentile, 20th percentile, people with just high school degrees, people without high school degrees, they were getting their share of economic growth. So that was a great, great thing. So we got to 4%, can you get lower? I'd be willing to try, I didn't, I mean, again, the benefits of going lower, because there is no story that it just goes like this, so let's say, I go, let's see if we can go to 3.5, and let's say I'm wrong. Well, inflation will gradually tick up, so you start to raise rates, and, you keep the unemployment, you keep the inflation rate from going up too much. And, to my view, the consequence of that, if the inflation rate were to go from 2 to 2.5, who cares? It's, this is, I mean, I know there's a lot of people that's absolutely heretical, the Fed, I think they throw you out on the street if you say that. But the reality is we've had inflation rates of 2.5, 3.5, 4%, and we've done fine. Other economies have done fine. So, again, I understand we don't want it to keep escalating. We don't want German hyperinflation. Can you go lower? I think it's certainly worth trying. The second part of your question, I'll try to keep this brief and short and simple. There's a school of economists associated with the University of Missouri, Kansas City, modern mantra is the term they often use, saying that deficits don't matter. There's, I think, a lot of case there, but I think they argue in kind of strange ways, and I think the rhetoric gets carried away. It's basically, to my view, a pretty straight Keynesian story that if an economy is below full employment, you could have a deficit. It doesn't put any strain on the economy, doesn't crowd out private investment. If you continue to run large deficits to the point where you're pushing the economy beyond full employment, you'll start to see inflation. So the limit on deficits is really inflation. I think that's essentially right. I think that basic story is essentially right. That would be qualified for, say, a country that didn't have its own currency. They would agree with that, of course. But I think that basic story is essentially right.
Let me pursue that a bit further. Right? The one thing that's different between the 1990s and now, of course, is that Greenspan, if he were here today, wouldn't have that ability to push interest rates still lower. We've already pushed that as far as we can go. And so the stimulus would have to be the way in which we achieve that low level of unemployment. Stimulus or exporting and through our trade surplus. So you can do this, certainly, and Paul Krugman writes about this quite eloquently. But we can't do it anymore through the same sort of monetary policy that Greenspan was using at that time.
Real briefly, the question about the NIRU, or natural rate of unemployment, and accelerating inflation, it's astounding how in economics you develop laws over singular events, and all kinds of other laws, the demand and supply curve that show that higher wages will cause unemployment. And generally how this kind of economics tends to create deterministic systems where you worry about things that might not be real at all. Generally speaking, the more progressive history of sort of moral economic thought has been that the economy is a human invention, and we can work on it rather than being captured by kind of invincible laws that can never be changed. And so there really is this big divide, and it's probably useful to think that progressives for a long time have said we can be experimental, and it's a human invention, not some kind of law of gravity.